Hey, hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Corey Mintz, a journalist, author, and friend of both the show and, well, me. He was one of the very first guests on this podcast, tackling planes, trains, and automobiles. He returned a couple of years later to discuss Big Night, and now he has an excellent new book coming out, The Next Supper, The End of Restaurants as We Knew Them and What Comes After. It's in stores everywhere, and I figured it was just a good excuse to get him back on the show. This time, Corey picked The Big Short, Adam McKay's 2015 comedy about the 2008 financial meltdown that devastated the American economy and subsequently the world's. But more specifically, it's about the handful of traders who saw it coming, realized nothing could stop it, and figured they'd make a few bucks. Ryan Gosling, Christian Bale, Steve Carell, and Brad Pitt are the biggest names in a packed cast, but the real star is McKay and Charles Randolph's Oscar-winning screenplay, which reconfigures the grim journalism of Michael Lewis's book into an unholy mashup of heist picture, disaster movie, and strangled comedy. You'll laugh until you don't. This is Someone Else's Movie.
I was actually having a lot of trouble figuring out, like, so what do I actually want to talk about? And then I knew you would ask me at some point, like, what kind of connects with my work or influenced me in some ways. And I ended up just going back over, like, what are the movies in recent years that I've really loved that I haven't really, like, spent a lifetime obsessing over that would be fun, as opposed to obviously the stuff from when you were 10 and the stuff that I've really fallen for in recent years has been like Get Out, Roma, The Fury Road, Lady Bird. And I definitely had a big emotional connection with Lady Bird, but The Big Short was the one that, I guess, Spotlight too. The Big Short was the one that I was probably most just wanted to rewatch. It's so fun. It just zips along. And it definitely like dovetails with my thinking about work in general and the idea of trying to make a complicated collection of information that you feel the audience should know, making it palatable and entertaining to them. And I think this movie succeeds wonderfully at that, which is the part that I wanted to get into.
Yeah, I watched it again. I guess it would have been Monday night with Kate, who had never seen it. She'd managed to miss it because I saw it at a 10 a.m. press screening and she couldn't come.
How did Kate feel about it?
She loved it. I knew she would too, because it's exactly her thing. Did
she knit through it?
Well, she always knits. That's
right.
Just inevitable. But there was a point where she put the knitting down because she was getting too invested in the story, and it would mean she would lose, like something would go wrong. It's the same reason she loves Moneyball. I think it's the sabermetrics of Moneyball versus the shell game of The Big Short, and the way that Adam McKay unpacks it so cleanly and manages to also make us realize how angry he is. Like, just the genius of casting Steve Carell, who at the time, I think he was either just coming off The Office or still on it, even possibly. I don't remember.
I think it's just after The Office ended.
It's 2015.
He was never shy. He was still making 3 movies a year while he was on The Office, right? So it wasn't like he was just breaking into movies in 2015.
Right. But his casting in this as the anti-Michael Scott seemed really clever, because everyone this poor man meets, everybody that Baum talks to, is either incompetent or deliberately withholding like information or skirting the law. And watching Carell get angrier and angrier at every dissemblance, at every again, it comes much earlier in the film than I'd remembered, but his shock at the, like, they're not confessing, they're boasting moment is so powerful. And it's so great to see. Well, I was going to say so great to see a comedian cast in a role like this, but of course that's the whole point of the film, is that McKay is doing the Soderbergh thing with the informant and casting funny people to play straight roles and use the energy in unpredictable ways.
Well, it's an additional thing. I mean, that's McKay's one of his gimmicks. But in addition to that, with this character, I mean, you talk about his slow burn. He starts the movie angry. Like he starts the movie by walking into a support group.
Yeah, a rageaholic support group, I assume.
Yeah, screaming at everybody. But he also, I mean, in the sort of disparate collection of protagonists, for lack of a better term, but all the characters we're supposed to follow, his character is probably the most likable, or rather has, it's hard to use like terms like this, but maybe has more noble motives than the rest of them.
Yeah, he has the fewest barriers to entry for us.
And yet he, as he's portrayed, is the least likable. He's so unhappy and angry that even in a room full of like obnoxious, loud, angry people, he's still the guy you're like, I don't want to spend time with him.
Yeah.
And it's so, yeah, it's just such a great bit of contrast having cast Carell, who, played this lovable jerk for years, to say, this is a better person, but a less lovable person. You don't want to hang out with this guy.
Yeah. He's a difficult hero, but then they're all, I mean, Christian Bale's performance is no warmer, right? Like he's playing someone who's a brick wall to everybody. We never even see him with his family, which would humanize him, right? But the film isn't interested in that. It just denies us that.
Yeah, every character is a challenge to the expectation that in a big budget star-driven movie that we like the characters.
Yeah.
I mean, none of them bring with them the seeds of the audience wanting to follow their adventures and see them succeed in their ambition. I mean, they all have a sort of different reason for doing what they're doing, which is, the unique concept, maybe not unique, but like the part of the idea behind the narrative structure is you're following multiple groups of people who are all basically trying to pull the same heist. I mean, it's basically a crime movie.
Yeah.
Where the government and the banks are like the mafia, and we're watching three different crews who have three different schemes for robbing the same casino. And yet none of them are good people. None of them are doing it. None of them are doing it out of Robin Hood like altruism. But they're the perfect vehicles to tell the story of the causes of the financial collapse. Right. The movie never, even while like casting great actors, charismatic people the audience is going to enjoy, never makes the mistake of thinking like we care about their lives more than they are simply the tool for telling a story that wouldn't get told if we went the usual sort of screenplay route and said, let's find one character whose story helps us see this piece of history. That would have been too limiting.
Yeah, no, you need a wide net and also a structure that allows us to dip in and out without ever worrying about the interconnections, right? I mean, the flurry of information that comes at us it would be incomprehensible if we didn't have them constantly trying to explain it to each other.
Everyone's doing an exposition dump to everyone else constantly.
Yeah, and in a way, it makes it a mystery film as well as a heist. The analog I was thinking of when I first saw it was the same thing that happens in The Social Network early on when characters are racing across the Harvard campus to see if something has worked. And Fincher shoots it like they're trying to stop a plague from getting loose, which, as it turns out, The Big Short has that similar sense of doom. Like there is something terrible coming in these. This is a disaster movie. Like they're the only ones who can see it coming, and they're powerless to stop it.
It is a disaster, and it takes, it comes out in 2015 after the disaster and after even the economic recovery, at a time where, just from my perspective as someone writing about food, I was a restaurant critic when this global recession began, and I sat in empty dining rooms that used to be filled with people with expense accounts ordering, big priced bottles of wine and tasting menus. And my little corner of the world, I saw it reshaped in a very short amount of time. And part of the upside was this big golden age of sort of affordable fine dining, for lack of a better term, where all of a sudden, like all these chefs from big restaurants went to smaller places and were doing their own thing. By 2015, so much of the world had forgotten the economic collapse. I mean, I did that. I remember I met these people who were like traders who had started a dog walking business, and there's so many people in that arena that were just trying to refigure their lives because banking was like on hold, or rather the markets were down. People had to refigure their careers. People had to go home and live with their parents. And at least in food, people ate, the offcuts because they were affordable, and chefs were doing something creative with them. And by 2014, 2015, people were back to luxury and lobster and prime cuts of meat and fancy restaurants with $1 million renovations. And people didn't want to remember, not to jump ahead to the conclusion of the movie, but like nothing got fixed. The banks didn't get regulated or broken up, certainly. So, some of the anger in the movie is about rubbing, I think, the audience's nose in recent history and saying, like, don't forget what just happened and what is probably going to happen again, because we didn't learn anything and we didn't change the rules of this broken system.
No, and in fact, the whole point of the denouement is that no one was ever going to change it. Right. Like the banks were betting on the bailouts. They knew they'd be fine. They knew they could ride this out. And that's exactly what happened. And again, it comes back to Carell on his little patio, which is, again, a wealthy person's home. Like we're never very far from thinking about just how much money all of these guys made from this, from betting, as Ben Rickard says, like, you bet against America, you bet against society, don't fucking dance. But every single one of these people.
A brilliant trick that the movie plays on the audience, because that's the heart of the movie there, right? Those few lines, right? He says something like every point the unemployment goes up,
40,000 people die,
right? And he tells these guys, just don't dance. You closed a big deal, you're going to make a lot of money, just don't dance. It's just that it's not just the characters who are dancing, the movie's dancing. It spent the last 5 minutes showing this montage of them making these big deals that they know are sucker bets because they're going to win and the economy's going to collapse theoretically. And the movie is playing a very sort of David Holmes, Ocean's 11 type of we're having fun caper music, which stops the second Brad Pitt turns to him and the audience and goes, let's remember the actual stakes here. But that's one of the moments where you realize that Adam McKay, who I don't know too much about, other than, I understand he was the head writer for Saturday Night Live, and I followed his film career. But you see that despite the fact that he's using like what looks to be stock footage, he's almost setting up scenes to look like, I don't have a budget, I had to throw it together with this cheap stock footage, that he is, along with obviously the editors who did a brilliant job, like really fine tuning the movie for its reaction, for its impact on the audience, to sort of set you up like that, to feel good for a moment watching these characters dance around, and to remind you of the harsh realities that the story is trying to explain.
When I interviewed him at the time, we talked about it, and I said it would be like watching Ocean's 13 if at the very last second a tourist wanders in, witnesses everything, and they have to bludgeon that tourist to death in front of you. Like, you just to remember that, oh no, this is a crime, these are bad people, and this is the price of that. And then try to
how we rig this whole thing.
Yeah, I would love to see. I mean, just the idea with George Clooney just turning his jacket inside out to cover the blood and then trying to pretend that everything's okay. That would be interesting to me. But here it's the sense that, the movie is furious. It's angrier than Mark Baum is at what's going on. It's just riding along with these guys because it's sort of trapped in Jared Vinette's perspective, because Gosling is our host. And again, that was something that he knew would work, because Ryan Gosling can be personable and funny even when he's playing an absolute shit.
He's pretty damn likable.
Yeah.
He's extremely likable. And he also, there's another very cute little shtick where he reminds the audience, I think, or it's the two younger traders. Early on in the movie, there's a scene where they get, I guess, tossed out of this big bank, and they're in the lobby and they find Ryan Gosling's prospectus, and they turn to the camera and say, "It didn't really happen like this. It actually happened like that." And it's a wonderful little reminder from the film, like, hey, you know, and we know, right? These kinds of movies, we have to combine characters and events to make things happen in a more compact way. It sometimes requires folding true to life aspects over each other in order to be efficient storytellers. You understand, right? And then later, Gosling turns to the camera again after something happens. He goes, "That actually happened," which is a lovely little two-part joke that's also sort of almost like a little director's commentary note attached to it to say, like, some things are true, some things are not true. But if I'm honest with you, then you can appreciate, like, it doesn't matter which parts exactly are like that.
Yeah.
You can go and do the research later, but it's more fun this way. Don't you agree it's more fun this way? But just to let you know, some shit that you think had to have been made up by a screenwriter, it actually happened. For example, all the big story of this movie, this actually happened. These banks committed this fraud, and this handful of people capitalized on it because they saw these market trends. That part is undeniable. And he also, like, he puts, similar to the casting of Carell, Jeremy Strong, is that his name?
Yeah, who is now an Emmy-winning Succession star.
He's huge now, right? I had never seen him before this movie. I definitely came out of this movie saying, that guy, he steals every scene he's in. And again, not because he's like the best looking guy, and I can say that. People have told me more than once I look like Nosferatu. I can say Jeremy Strong and his chain is not exactly naturally going to be stealing scenes from Ryan Gosling, and yet, even as he kind of seems to throw away every line while chewing gum, he's the shtick he does, where even though there's other people in the office who are specifically described as being kind of annoyingly optimistic, McKay puts into Jeremy Strong's mouth the line about, yeah, but bankers are going to go to jail, right? And the banks could be broken up and regulated. He puts that level of naivety, which has to be asked just for the audience to go, oh, yeah, right. Nobody went to jail for this.
Yeah.
There's no repercussions. He takes the most cynical, mean-spirited, aggressively negative guy and makes him be so hopefully naive, just to tickle, the audience's reaction. They're like to remind them of how they felt in late 2008, early 2009. We were like looking, as we remember, seeing what was happening, going like, there must be some repercussions, and there weren't. And then
there's a documentary. There's an excellent documentary by Steve James called Abacus, and it's the story of the only bank that was actually investigated and prosecuted, and it was a small family-run Chinese bank in New York City, founded by immigrants who were trying to help other immigrants, and they were the ones that the American justice system came down on them. Yeah,
I think I've seen the trailer for this movie, so it's good.
It's great. It's also just as angry. Yeah,
it should be.
Yeah,
Small Enough to Jail. I have to see this movie.
Yes, I may have a link, and if I do, I'll send it to you. But it's going to be it's PBS, so it should be available to stream from their website.
But there is also, you mentioned that kind of horror movie aspect, and I think that it's worked really well in the second act, when I guess, like, once all the players have placed their bets, and it begins with the young investor partners, and they're watching TV, and I think they see the news about some mortgage broker going bankrupt, and they say it started, and it is absolutely like a horror movie tone. And then I think for the next 3 minutes, we watch as our main characters pull their hair out, trying to decipher why the regulators aren't acknowledging why these credit ratings in the banks stocks are not going down despite, this rash of mortgage failures and the bond failures across the board. And, leads to the conclusion of because everyone is colluding on this massive fraud, but it does unfold like almost a creeping supernatural horror, maybe because, the characters at the center of it all sort of pride themselves on being smart people who have figured things out. They're like the scientists in a horror movie who are like, but this is impossible. This can't be.
Yeah. It's preying on our understanding of genre and also on our expectation that everything will work out fine because we're following a bunch of nice, dedicated people, right? They're all principled. They might be principled in ways that we don't accept, but they are, as you say, like they're still naive enough to believe in the structure of the system, and that betting against it is something they all get very excited about, but also secretly, or maybe not so secretly, just don't want to happen because it would be calamitous. And the thing that really struck me in the depiction of Ben Rickert is that he has gone off and become a prepper and opened a seed garden, and he's acting as a survivalist basically without being one. But then there's that scene where he shows up in an airport wearing a mask and nods at the one other person wearing a mask. And I'm like, fuck, what?
Yeah, a little too prescient.
Yeah, that feels so on point that I now want to subscribe to Ben Rickert's newsletter and find out what else I should be doing.
Yeah, it's such a nicely defined character in so few scenes, especially strange, like to have a star of that magnitude in a role that small. But he's the heart of the movie, right? I mean, he's the one sort of decent character.
Yeah, I think so. Unerringly so, anyway.
Well, but what does he do other than help these two young guys get rich? It's not like he, other than remind the audience what's at stake, it's not like he does something to help anyone.
That's fair. I know that Pitt was knocked at the time for his production company making movies that he then gets to play the most virtuous humans in. So he's the Canadian in 12 Years a Slave who helps free Solomon at the end of the film, and here he shows up in this as the closest thing to a moral conscience.
Sure,
but he's good at it. Like he's really good.
He's a good actor. He's a superstar, and he's acting as producer. Why not? I mean, Michael Douglas, who was a huge star at some point, and who also was a very active movie producers, knew better than to cast himself as the good guy in small roles, because that wouldn't have worked if Michael Douglas showed up and said, hey, I'm going to set things straight. I'm going to remind the audience what really matters tonight, because he wouldn't do that, because he knew I'm Michael Douglas. The audience loves to hate me. I'm the 80s corporate scumbag. Like, I think Brad Pitt understands his value, it's not like he was like, I'm dying to play this part. It will make me feel good. No, I think he knows his value as a star and what he can do to help the movie. Not to make too many presumptions about Mr. Pitt.
I think he is excruciatingly aware of his image, right? Like, I think that's why his most interesting performances are the ones that subvert it. And when he does these things, he can lean into the idea that he was a golden boy in the 90s, and the slightly gone to seed thing that works for him in these roles. It's
less egregious in this movie than in 12 Years a Slave, where he shows up late in the movie, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's the guy who springs Solomon. He gets him out.
Yeah, and he's way too angelic, right? The way he just shows up and he's all of a sudden like, hey, guess what? There's this great white guy, and it's me, Brad Pitt. As opposed to here, he's threaded through. He's an actual character in the movie.
Oh yeah.
The story, I mean.
Yeah, I think Steve McQueen is using him that way as like the literal white savior in 12 Years a Slave, because Steve McQueen is working in that sort of archetypal thing. But
I guess so.
Yeah, the fact that it is Brad Pitt who produced the movie does throw
it's jarring in that movie, given the makeup of that movie. Whereas here, this is a movie that is already very involved with the managing of celebrity personas for all they're worth. The first time I saw it, much as I enjoyed the movie, I was so angry at the movie for that the Margot Robbie scene at the beginning,
Okay.
which is the first of the three scenes where the audience has relatively or increasingly complex financial terms explained to them through guest stars. And, the first one with Margot Robbie, who's a terrific actor, but I think Gosling just turns to the camera and he's like, this is boring to you, right? Why don't I get Margot Robbie in a bathtub to explain it to you? And she does. And I think she pretty much just reiterates what he just said. But there was just I felt so condescended to. I thought like, no, I care. I came to see this movie. I'm paying attention. Why are you talking down to me? And then we get the Bourdain scene where he's explaining the mortgage bonds are just reusing the same ingredients and they're no good. And then we get some scientist.
Oh, it's Selena Gomez and an economist. Yeah.
And a very long scene, but an essential scene explaining, I think, an important aspect, which is that like there are more virtual bets in the market than there are value of the things that are being insured. I think it's 20-1, and they do it through this beautiful virtual casino where people are betting on other people's bets, and it's a very complex thing, but it's so beautifully explained, and it's pretty essential to the plot, and it justifies all of it. But I just felt insulted by like the filmmaker telling me like, look, you're dumb, right? You probably need this explained to you. And then I saw it again and I realized how much they were juggling and how much information needs to come across. And that at the same time, this isn't a story of like, here's a story of one family who lives in Ohio that we're following all these different people, and they're all kind of assholes to some degree. Like they're just not super likable proxies for the audience. So like we're not emotionally attached to the characters. There's so much math and history and financial science being explained. Like, yes, you do need sometimes not only to talk down to the audience a little bit, but even to tell the audience that, like to hold their hand and say like, listen, I'm going to condescend to you for a minute. I hope that's okay. And it is. And then I felt guilty about my initial reaction to the movie because it's so aware of what it's doing.
Yeah.
It's not like it was a last minute thing.
It is condescending because Jared Vinette is condescending to us. And since he's the narrator, that's his persona leaking through. It's like, oh, come on, you can't follow this because I'm smarter than you.
That's a classic Norm justification where you're saying like the character is writing the script almost.
Well, yeah, but then
that's what's happening.
But you do get that reversal halfway through too, where he turns to the camera and says, I never said I was the good guy. And, we are locked into his version of events, and he still hates himself enough that he won't be self-aggrandizing, which I think is great. I mean, if Jared Vinette was really our narrator and telling the story, we wouldn't have that moment in the bathroom where he ends his call and his voice cracks when he does his little salute to himself, because that's Ryan Gosling having a great time with the character. It's not how Jared Vinette wants to be seen. But it is this sort of bubbling synthesis of all of the ideas that are going on in the movie that McKay has built enough of an arena that I would buy that I would actually accept all of these things as being told by Vinette, because look at him waving his $47 million check at us, right? Like he wants to preen just as much as the assholes in Florida do.
I guess so. But if that's true, then that's because the writer and director have concluded you need an insider to tell you.
Sure.
You need someone inside the asshole's asshole to tell you what this was like, because who else knows the truth and can see the situation for what it was? A handful of people who were able to capitalize it. Yeah, they're not the best people.
Yeah, Michael Burry has no perspective outside of himself. Like, I don't think we never see Bale with any of the other leads, right? He only ever talks to his functionary and Tracy Letts.
All the scenes are in his office, right? Like he never even goes anywhere, right?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Tracy Letts comes in for a scene, which is great because we all love Tracy Letts.
Tracy Letts, star of Ghostbusters Afterlife.
You're not going to derail this conversation by making me care about Ghostbusters Afterlife?
I'm not going to even try.
I'm a Ghostbusters 2 person. That's the only good Ghostbusters movie. I don't know. It's so strange that there's this one character who is so central and yet like is basically just doing phoners. Like he interacts with Tracy Letts and there's a few other people in the office. I think the first scene he's talking to a new hire. He has a quick chat with somebody, but most of his scenes, he's in his office. He's typing in a computer. He's on the phone. I don't know if Bob Newhart's on the other end, but like, he's going for it. And sometimes he's super like showy, he's being super Christian Bale. He's got the makeup and the teeth caps and the ridiculous haircut and he's hamming it up. But then majority, like 75% of the time, he is doing quiet little things. He is just like quietly reacting to this storm around him. The big dramatic moves for him is him going out to the dry erase board and writing how much the stock or the portfolio is down and putting so much into his like physicality, just lying on the floor. His distance from everyone else too is the other thing that makes the character shine. The idea that he is, I guess, mildly autistic and is slightly distanced from people and yet has a capacity to talk very openly about that.
Yeah, there's the key scene where he says, like, if someone asks him if he's being sarcastic, he says, I don't know how. This is all he can do.
Yeah.
There's a purity in that character. And Bale, I mean, for all of his inclinations to go big, he's consistent in the performance, right? It's not a cartoon. This is a person who just can't express himself any other way than he is doing, but all the behaviors make sense.
His biggest moments are playing the drums, right? Which is in character. That's what the character does to express himself because he can't do it verbally, which is, it's great. And, the soundtrack then plays the metal music that he's listening to super loud, which is when Victoria, my wife, says, then can you turn it down a bit because we just put our daughter to sleep. And this, it's like, that's the action scene version of this movie. That's the scene that makes you reach for the remote control. All right, we got to turn it down a little bit because we're hoping somebody is drifting off into slumberland. We don't have to go in there and give her a bottle or anything. We don't have to talk like this. Good night, sweetums.
It's a nice way of demonstrating the chaos in Bury too, that this is probably how the world sounds to him all the time. And we're just riding along. Yeah.
Plus, the reality of his character's situation, which is he has just pushed all the chips from this fund that he's managing into one bet that no one believes in. Everyone's angry at him and saying, give me my money back. And he has to keep going on for, I think, a year with the bank saying, we want interest payments and clients saying we want to pull our money out. And he's right. And we see at the end that he's made this ungodly, truly a horrific amount of money, right? Because the other characters make, I think, the young traders make like $100 million or something. And Carell and his firm make like $1 billion. And the Scion group that Christian Bale managed, he writes on the board like
it's 479, I think, right? Yeah,
yeah, profit on $1 billion bet. So he's cleared like $500 billion.
Yeah,
it's an amount of money that shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist in anyone's hands, and yet somebody figured out how to wrestle it away from. Well, I guess from the crooks who had it is how the audience can feel good about it.
Right. But of course, we also see the absolute gutting of the American economy happening to make that happen. Right. But it's not Bury's fault for seeing it coming. And I think that's what saves it. That's what makes the film pleasurable, even as it's just rolling down to hell, is we're watching people who just know a secret.
Yeah, we're watching the thieves who stole from the bigger thieves. Yet, no, they did not give it to the poor or the needy, but at least they took it from the bad guys. I mean, I think that's how I feel going away from it. More than anything else, the movie is like I think it's McKay's version of what late period Spielberg devotes a lot of his time to, which is movies that almost are made for high school history class. Like movies that your teacher is going to wheel in the TV VCR on Friday afternoons and say, all right, we're going to learn about Lincoln. We're going to learn about the Cold War. We're going to learn about the Munich, whatever. Like, it's really just a Spielberg film series. But there's like a lot of Spielberg movies that I like them, or I like parts of them, but they almost seemed made for like teenagers who are never going to learn history in class to at least get it through films. I mean, I understand Spielberg is an actual filmmaker who's making movies to be seen in a movie theater, but I think they get a lot of play like that.
Yeah, he's making the best versions of those educational films because, Lincoln is written by genuine writers who understand like how to animate the ideas in Team of Rivals, and Munich is the finale aside is a really interesting meditation on post 9/11 vengeance and Jewish identity. But yeah, it's the discuss amongst yourselves school of filmmaking. You watch this, then argue it out, and those are your term papers.
Yeah, and can't you picture the teacher, pressing pause and say, "We're going to watch the next half next week, but I want people to think about, this. What did Lincoln mean when he said this?" And I can see this movie, even though yes, it's to play for contemporary audience of 18 to 35-year-olds that it's targeted at, but it's also intended as a bit of a historical document to play in junior high classes to introduce an idea that, by the time you're in grade 9, this is all ancient history. If this happened when you were 10 years old, you don't care. Unless your parents lost their jobs, this isn't something you're paying attention to. But 5 years from now, Ryan Gosling's still going to be a big star, and you'll watch a movie with him in it because people told you it was good and you like Ryan Gosling. So you just might sit still for this movie instead of texting when the teacher wheels in that TV VCR or whatever the first. I don't know how teachers play movies. I don't know what format do teachers use to play movies in class now?
According to Ghostbusters, it is still VHS.
Stop trying to talk about Ghostbusters.
It's in theaters now. We have a duty to address it.
The listeners can't tell, but Norm is texting me about Ghostbusters right now. He's sending me spoilers. He's sending me gifs.
Nothing but screen grabs and spoilers. I was going to say that the other really smart thing it does is tell a recent historical story through the veneer of, can you believe this shit? Now it would be, the revelations in this movie will make your jaw drop. Click here to read more. It would be something just so catchy and SEO based. But McKay, when I interviewed him, he was saying that it was such a simple concept to explain once he started explaining it. That the subprime mortgage collapse was, and this is his quote. He said, I just kept explaining it to people and no one ever had a problem with it because we were told over and over again, mostly by Bush officials in 2008, that, this is so complex that, there's no way we can possibly explain it. You have to trust the Fed and give money to the banks, and this will fix America. And it did not. But McKay was saying, you can boil it down to this sentence. They had a bunch of mortgages. They would sell them to pension funds. Then they ran out of good mortgages. So they put shit mortgages in there, but they were still calling them AAA. And he says, people would just look at him and say, that's it. And say, that's it. Then they did other shit. And the central premise of the movie is that everyone should know this simply, and that there's no reason not to have this information. And it's true. It took another 7 years for a movie to come out that explained it that succinctly. And that's just amazing to me.
Well, he's so eager to make this movie that he is almost cramming the prologue into the credits of the other guys.
Yes, we did talk about that people said, all of a sudden you're this big, issues guy. And I'm like, no, the other guys is all about, it ends with an animatic over the end credits about financial fraud. Like, you've always been this guy. And he said, yeah, I've just never been this angry all the time. Like this angry enough to make the movie, I think is what he meant. Well,
it's such an interesting route you say route or route?
Everybody's saying route these days.
Okay.
I like route.
I started saying pecan recently. I was interviewing somebody from down south about barbecue, and I was saying something about pecan. Or he asked me, do you use pecan wood? And I was like, I'm going to start saying pecan. This sounds a lot classier than pecan. But the root of McKay's career, like from comedy into the stuff he's doing now, even though Succession. When I was watching Succession, and I noticed like it almost seems like every scene is written like a comedy scene, and they're just playing it seriously. Mm-hmm. Like every scene has a joke and a butt. And Vice, which is like so jokey and so comedy focused for a biography of Dick Cheney. But the turning point is the end credit sequence in this wacky comedy. The other guys, Will Ferrell, and is it Mark Wahlberg?
Wahlberg, yeah.
And yeah, listener, if you haven't seen the other guys, even if you don't see the other guys, just watch the end credits. It's a 5-minute animated sequence that goes on and on about financial fraud, seeking to explain it over the end credits of a wacky Will Ferrell comedy. And it tells you that the director is just like, this has to come out somewhere. The end credits, much as the other guys, yes, the villain is like this banker. It wasn't necessary to do that in the end credits, and yet he's just like, I need to be talking about this. And of course, like it comes out through this. And I guess maybe the studio obviously he had stars attached, and they're like, you can do whatever you want. We have stars like this attached, but I think this Moneyball, which is the author is of the same book, or the writer also wrote Moneyball, right?
Yeah, Michael Lewis is of course the Moneyball guy.
There you go, yeah. But that must have additionally convinced people like the audience can sit still for math if Brad Pitt is on the screen. Moneyball is the only movie about sports I've seen in the last 20 years. Like sports is such a huge turnoff. I don't want to see anything. I don't want to listen to anything about sports. I saw Moneyball, loved it, like very well made movie. And because it's about business, to me, it's not a sports movie. It's not a movie about like sports movies about whether they win the big game or fight at the end. And this is like Moneyball is about business and it proved the audience can follow that aspect of it, which they do here, I think. And I don't know if anybody at the PAC screening that I was at came out going, what the hell were they talking about? I think the movie really holds your hand to the exact calibration that it needs to. I mean, like I said, I felt insulted.
Yeah.
But I think that's good. I think every once in a while, it's good to, I use this phrase a lot, but like to rub the audience's nose in it. Because sometimes we almost need to feel a little bit of shame about, not for our ignorance, but just for what our world is made of, you know, to like have that truth of it rubbed in us, in our face, the way you do to punish a dog, to say like, I just don't want you to do this again. I don't want you to feel bad. Like, I don't want you to pee on this spot again. And I want you to connect this emotionally with feeling bad a bit. We just finished watching that, I think it's called Turning Point, a documentary series about 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
And spoiler alert, if you have not either seen this or followed the news, but it goes back to the early 90s, to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and all the way through to this last summer. And one of the last moments in the movie's endless series of epilogues and final moments is Afghani civilians and soldiers footage from last May or April, talking about how, yes, the Americans are pulling out, but it's not going to change this. Like, this country, we've taken it back. Taliban's not going to resume power. We're going to stay. We're going to fight for what we believe in. This is a new Afghanistan. We're committed. You know, soldiers saying like, I'm not going to give up. And it's so painful in the wake of, what has happened. in last month, and the Taliban just in a split second resuming control of that country. It's painful to watch, and you need to see that. You need to be reminded of like just how people felt not so long ago in relation to what has actually happened. And I think that he, like in The Big Short, he does a good job skirting the line in a movie that seeks to, make the audience laugh often enough that you don't fall into hating the movie or hating the experience of watching the movie, while getting as angry as they can get you to be.
Yeah, as angry as he is. He wants us to match his rage.
Yeah, which is an interesting challenge, right? If a director is making a movie about grief or joy or love or whatever it is, to get you to feel that thing, I think that's what he's on about here. And I think he's certainly successful.
Well, this is obviously the perfect time to ask. You have just written a book about the collapse of an industry that no one ever thought could fail. So was The Big Short an influence at all? Did you learn anything? Is there a flip book of Margot Robbie in a bubble bath in the middle of chapter 6?
I didn't use that device, but I did use another storytelling tool from this movie. And it was, I think, unintentionally a big influence. I was definitely angry when I came up with the idea for the book and when I was writing the proposal. And if anything, I was trying to tamp down that anger. I mean, also at the advice of an editor and an agent. But I mean, the book comes from me having been a cook and then a restaurant critic and then a columnist about food for many years, and then starting to segue my career into writing more about labor and the systemic issues in the food and restaurant world, and being really angry at what I saw. And I proposed this book, which became sort of about all the systemic issues in restaurants, but also about the proposed solutions for these things, what people are doing better, packaged as a guide for how we can find a better way to choose where to eat, because we want to support businesses that are doing good in the world as opposed to evil. So it comes from a place of being that kind of almost bitter level angry about these things. But I had only seen The Big Short once in the theater. And as I mentioned, I was kind of pissed at what I felt was kind of talking down to me. Mm-hmm. And I didn't watch it again until midway through working on the book. I remember I was staying with my wife's parents and working in my father-in-law's old office. And I had just done this interview, and we were talking about the oversaturation of chain restaurants. And somebody mentioned to me the economist Michael Jensen, and how he had really been a big part of advancing a change in the way that we compensate CEOs. And the short version of that is he proposed the idea that CEOs should be compensated based on stock performance. And it really ushered in, people argue, an era of short-termism versus caring about the long-term health of the company and the country where the company is located and the people who live in that place. And I came with this idea for one of my chapters, specifically like the chapter that's about like chain and fast food restaurants as opposed to the chef-driven and all the different genres of restaurants. And what if like I could sort of begin the chapter of like this sort of flashback of, the real villain of restaurants is this economist from the 70s. And as I sort of started to sketch out this idea and write a few sort of paragraphs, even while I was months away from actually writing any chapters, I kind of wrote it up and let it sit there. And then I think maybe The Big Short just started playing on Netflix at that time. And I saw it and I started rewatching it. And it very quickly, the movie opens on exactly that idea, and which I must have stolen subconsciously, you know what I mean? Or at least if it occurred to me, something in my brain went, oh, it's probably a good idea because you have an example of it working. And because the movie opens with this scene of this financial whatever analyst or stockbroker in the 70s come up with this idea for mortgage-backed securities. and how, even though this person didn't mean any ill by it, it set the fuse for this explosive cataclysm in 2009. And it works so well. And I remember just seeing that and going, okay, so it's a good idea. It works, and the chapter ended up, being structured very differently. It's in the middle of the chapter, not at the beginning, but it definitely, it was very helpful to see that. And then as I kept watching the movie, I go, wow, this is what you're trying to do done very well. It's also a movie, not a book, and it's got movie stars, so don't sweat it in comparison. But the general theme of like, anytime you say to someone, for example, an editor, you're trying to grapple with all these big ideas and they're saying, you need to focus. And you say something like, all these ideas are related, or all these things are interconnected. It's always time to calm down and listen to your editor or wife or therapist or or whoever it is who's trying to talk you down off the ledge, and be reminded, like, you've got to narrow your focus in order to tell a story that the audience is going to care about. And so the movie was really helpful in reminding me of that, because it is so expertly told. And, when I got to the Margot Robbie scene, instead of going, oh, you're trying to dumb it down for me, I thought, no, you're trying to make 100% bulletproof sure that I understand what you're talking about, because that's your job. You're the storyteller. And so that really helped me feel comfortable at the same, and needing to do the same thing. I realized, like, as a writer, just make sure the audience understands what you're talking about, and then you can take them somewhere new. But you can't move on until you know that they're doing that. And also, I had the benefit, I realized, of not just being angry, but trying to be constructive at the same time. Something this movie doesn't need to concern itself with. It's documenting a terrible event. It doesn't need to take responsibility for saying, and here's how we should be restructuring banking, because it's a movie and not the government.
Yeah. So feel free not to reveal this if it blows the ending of your book, but is the restaurant industry salvageable? I mean, do you feel optimistic, or do you feel the same sort of depression that we feel at the end of The Big Short?
I feel tremendously optimistic. I mean, the pessimistic part of me comes from something we talked about in The Big Short, and that is the idea that after a disaster, there's such a gravitational pull toward the status quo, and people want to get back to the way things were, which in the restaurant industry was very inequitable for almost everybody. That is something I don't want to happen in a way that we've seen in the financial and in the real estate industries. But in terms of where restaurants are right now, yes, they've had this meteor come out of the sky and crash into them, but they already had this overlapping series of terrible illnesses that they weren't being treated for. And as a result of the cataclysm, workers have regrouped and gone, whoa, I don't know if I'm ready to re-up. I don't know if I want to redeploy. Mm-hmm. And, we've seen 25% of the workforce say, I'm not going back to work, for a variety of reasons. Only one of them is the fact that they had a break for the first time in their working lives. And they had a moment to realize, I don't know that this works for me, being a happy, healthy individual who hopes to maybe start a family or own property someday, or not work nights, or whatever the issues are. So I think we're at a pivot point, much as everybody hates the word pivot, where there's real potential for change in the industry at various levels of different types of restaurants. I think a lot of it is really contingent on the two factors, which are workers being able to capitalize on a moment where the power dynamic has shifted in their favor for the first time in generations, and diners caring about the people who make their food enough to voice their concern and want to stand with workers, whether that means, avoiding a place that's being picketed, or supporting the kind of business that they believe in, and, using just a handful of really simple techniques to figure out, like, okay, so just stay away from this type of restaurant. And the type of restaurants I do know and love, and I've already figured out these are good people, keep going back to them and giving them a business and tipping well or whatever it is. Like being a good patron and just supportive of the change you actually want to see in the world. So not to seem too naively optimistic, but I think there's reason to hope for a better future for restaurants and their workers right now.
My thanks to Corey Mintz, whose new book, The Next Supper, The End of Restaurants as We Knew Them and What Comes After, is in bookstores everywhere. Support your independent bookseller if you can. And if you've enjoyed listening to Corey, you should know he reads the audiobook version too. You can find Corey on Twitter at Corey Mintz, all one word, and you can find The Big Short on Blu-ray and DVD from Paramount Home Entertainment. It's also streaming on Netflix and Amazon Prime Video in Canada and in the US on Pluto TV. And you can rent or buy it on VOD pretty much everywhere. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com, where I host the Now What podcast every Friday. In fact, this last one has Corey on it too. And you can find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, SEMcast, and pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been enjoying us. Every little bit helps, it truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're there. Watch movies, stay safe, wear a mask if you go out. Please get your shot. I'll see you next time.